National unveiled their 2025 budget on Thursday. Said to be a growth budget, many Kiwis are wondering, growth for who? With changes to KiwiSaver, a big tax break for businesses, and major investments in health, law and order, and defense, this year's budget is either a bold economic reset or just the reshuffling of the same old deck. In this video, I'll unpack everything you need to know, line by line, sorting through over 6,000 lines of spending. As always, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, but for now, let's get into it. What we got on Thursday was exactly what you'd expect from a national-led government. Fiscal prudence, no-nonsense branding, and not a lot of frills. And to some degree, they certainly delivered. Their operational allowance, that's the new money they've given themselves to play with, is just $1.3 billion this year, the lowest in a decade. Later in this video, we'll go department by department to see what's been cut, what's been boosted, and what's quietly slipped through without the media spin. Over the coming days, as there wasn't much else to speak of, expect to hear a lot about the KiwiSaver shakeup and that new tax write-off for business investment, which I'll explain shortly. But make no mistake, this government is still spending more than any other in New Zealand's history. We're still running deficits, and if this budget was a household, they'd be maxed out on 2 credit cards and eyeing up a third. So while the tone has changed, the scale of the underlying problem has not. So perhaps the biggest announcement for everyone at home was the KiwiSaver announcement. The default contribution rate is getting bumped up from 3% to 4%, but in 2 steps. 3.5% in 2026, then 4% by 2028. And yes, that includes the amount your employer must match. So that sounds good for long-term savers, but here's the sting. The government contribution is getting slashed in half. Instead of 50 cents on the dollar, it'll now be 25 cents, maxing out at just over $260 a year. High-income earners, or those earning over $180,000 a year, will get nothing at all moving forwards. And yes, 16 and 17-year-olds will finally start receiving government contributions. So more people saving, less government top-up. A classic give with one hand and take with the other. So if you're in KiwiSaver, you'll contribute more, as will your employer, but the government is slowly exiting from making their contribution. For most, this should be a net positive that will see you have a larger pool of funds when you withdraw. But if you're outside of KiwiSaver, say you're self-employed, currently unenrolled, or compensated on a package basis, there is nothing here to lure you into the scheme. So KiwiSaver continues to work for some, but not for all. The other big change is the tax break for businesses. Called Investment Boost, it lets companies immediately deduct 20% of the cost of new assets on top of standard depreciation. Think machinery, tools, and equipment. The idea is to boost productivity and make New Zealand a more attractive place to invest. I personally like this plan as it will encourage businesses to start spending again and investing in their fixed assets. And when businesses invest, they often expand, hiring more staff, paying better wages, and creating more opportunities for everyday Kiwis. The Treasury reckons it'll lift GDP by 1% and wages by 1.5% over the next 2 decades. Critics, however, will see it as a handout to companies, while everyday Kiwis still face rising costs of living and butter. So those are 2 of the larger announcements. Let's now look at the raw details. Last year, the government collected $152 billion in revenue and spent $186 billion. So the government overspent by $33 billion. In today's budget for 2026, the government expects to collect $157 billion and spend $188 billion. So the shortfall drops by around 10% from $33 billion to $30 billion. As I said before, red or blue, they both love to spend more than what they collect. Now where does this money come from? Debt. So under national, we're setting all-time highs. But the great thing to see is on the right of that table. While Labour was extracting 4 to 10% more revenue out of workers every year, National across 2 years has dropped this to just 1 to 3%. The budget in 2026 has increased by an operating allowance of $1.3 billion, sure, but in percent terms it's just 0.7% in an environment where inflation is still above 2%. So this should be commended. National promised voters they would rein in spending, and without making any major cuts, they've definitely delivered. Nominally, it's up, but net of inflation, it's actually down. So without going all act party on the state of things, this is a positive sign, but more must be done to stop the escalation of debt. Let's now look at the government's income. A whopping 77% of the government's revenue comes from the IRD. Over the last year and 5 years, the IRD and customs revenue has tracked growth year over year of around 3 to 4%. We'll dig deeper later in the video to explain these variances, but the government expects much more revenue from the Ministry of Transport, but much less from the Treasury and Health. So overall, the budget forecasts a 3.1% increase in government revenue over the coming year. Over on the expenses side, you have the mega ministries. Social development is by far the largest, costing taxpayers $48 billion a year, half of which covers the cost of New Zealand's super. Health, education, the IRD, the Treasury, and transport all cost over $10 billion a year. According to Stats NZ, New Zealand has just under 3 million workers. Dividing these costs, the average worker pays over $3,600 a year for each of these services. If we ignore the headlines and politicians' rule, you can actually see National have increased their spending in health, education, and social development. We'll keep the video going, but as you look down the list, the Ministries of Transport and Environment have got much more money in this budget, while the Defence Force and Housing have seen large declines. These are the headline figures though, so let's jump into the details, starting with income. Right at the top of the list, accounting for 35% of government revenue, are source deductions. In other words, PAYE income tax, and growing 4.7% to $55 billion. Following that is GST and company tax, all expected to increase by 2 to 4%. Major drops in revenue are projected from interest on impaired student loans and winding back of COVID initiatives for small businesses. Overall, the average New Zealander contributes a little under $23,000 a year to the IRD. Moving over to customs, the government expects to earn more through their charging of GST on imported goods and excise duties on tobacco and alcohol. The Treasury, on the other hand, expects a 20% drop in revenue. There's nothing much to see here, but we do see a drop in interest earned on deposits, in line with what we see on our mortgages, and the effect of interdepartment transfers. The Ministry of Transport, however, is the most interesting, as they expect a 72% uplift in next year's revenue. A new line item called Vested Asset Revenue was introduced, explaining most of the change. Unfortunately, the details in these reports are brief, but searching through a few other documents, I suspect this comes from the transfer of City Rail Link assets to KiwiRail. Changes to RUCs will bring in $160 million, registration another $160 million, and infringement, aka tickets, another $50 or so million. So netting all of that together, transport income is definitely up in this year's budget. In the Ministry for the Environment, the emissions trading scheme accounts for $2.5 billion in revenue, slightly up over the next year, while moves to increase the waste management levy are expected to bring in another $25 million. The Ministry of Health has a blanket 6% lift in revenue for most of their income streams. An interdepartment transfer of $300 million last year from Pharmac gives the illusion of an 11% cut in revenue earned. However, if we exclude that, it's actually a 3.6% increase. And over at MB, we have seen two large areas that have seen recent changes: the immigration levy and the international visitor levy. Both of these charges expect to yield a further 35% in revenue next year. Over recent years, the government has increased the cost of these services, next year bringing in a further $107 million. Beyond that, we have departments bringing in $1 billion or less in revenue, so I'll call out the interesting line items. Recently, the government has announced further crackdowns on overseas student loan borrowers. In this year's budget, they expect to collect a further $22 million in borrowing, a 21% increase over last year. Over at LINZ, or NZTA, the government has turned the tap on $150 million more in revenue. Again, the details are light, but these changes see the department generate 300% more revenue in 2026. And beyond that, all the other sources of revenue are too small to comment. $100 million to us is a lot of money, but to a government, it's as minor as deciding between spending $20 at Domino's or $25 at Hell's Pizza. So that rounds out the revenue side of the budget. Let's now jump into the expenses. Right up the top of the list, we have New Zealand's largest cost, superannuation. This sets us back $24.7 billion a year. This year's budget only grew by $1.3 billion, so by growing the superannuation bill by 1.5, $200 million in cuts in this budget are directly caused by super. And the cost of super is expanding by 6.5% a year, which is twice as fast as the government's revenue. I have a lot of thoughts on this that I might share in another video if I'm brave enough, but unless changes are made, it'll either result in more taxes or more cuts. So following that, we see a 4% increase in spending on job seeker allowances, supported living payments, and sole parent support, up 3%. Despite being termed a growth budget, I'm sure this is the type of growth they won't put in the papers. So while National get bagged for not caring about the less fortunate, let's also appreciate that they're actually spending more every year on them, despite fiscal pressures. What is interesting to see is a 15% increase in spending on student loans over the next year. The government is also throwing $110 million at a broad improving employment outcomes, so they're pushing lots of funding into supporting and helping people outside of the workforce. Despite spending billions more on various areas of social development, there are a few areas they've actually made cuts. Family violence support and emergency housing are just two areas that have seen cuts. As we scroll through this list, the red on the right shows where the government is spending more, and the green where they're spending less. So as we scroll down, you can see many cuts to smaller services to partly support the larger ones. Overall, they're spending $2.5 billion more, or a little under $1,000 per worker, to support these schemes. So if anyone says National is spending less, send them this video, along with the full spreadsheet down below in the video description. Moving along, we have the Ministry of Health costing $31 billion a year, 16% of the budget, or $10,600 per worker. Hospitals will see a 6% increase in their funding next year, while GP and community services will see a further 6.5%. Pharmac, our national drug purchaser, will see a 4.2% more funding. So with inflation in the low twos, it's positive to see a large uplift in healthcare spending. The next two items are one and the same, relating to capex spending. Over $1 billion will be spent over the next year on financing the build of the Dunedin Hospital. Again, we see many of the smaller services cut to fund the larger services. Next along is the Ministry of Education, costing $23 billion a year, 12.5% of the budget, or $8,000 per worker. Early childhood, primary and secondary schools will see 3 to 4.5% more funding over the coming year. The Property Management Fund, however, stays roughly the same. Of note is a doubling in spending on school transport and a 15% cut in the cost of delivering meals to schools. A lot of political damage for a weak $40 million in savings this year. To put that into perspective, the government spends more on scholarships and awards for teachers every year. They're also spending 80% more on school attendance and engagement activities to address issues of school truancy since the pandemic. And again, as we scroll down, the smaller stuff sees cuts to put more money into the headline cost centers. Of note is the $150 million saving by funding the final year of studies instead of the first year, buying them a few more years of not having to fund the scheme. Then we reach the inland revenue, accounting for $19.5 billion a year in spending. Largely, these are repackaged social development schemes like KiwiSaver and various tax credits. The government is the country's largest employer, so the top line accounts for their obligations as an employer to thousands of people across the country. As we work through the list of other items, the government plans to write off $400 million less in debt than last year. You'll also see a 48% saving in KiwiSaver tax credits. This is from the changes we spoke about earlier by halving the government contribution on KiwiSaver, saving $500 million a year. You'll also see a 6% drop in Best Start tax credits following their announcement there as well. Family Boost, on the other hand, is getting a 30% increase, among several other changes as you see here. Next along is the Ministry of Transport, costing $12 billion a year, 17% up on last year, now absorbing 6.8% of the budget. Right up the top, you'll see a $1.6 and $0.8 billion transaction to acquire the City Rail Link assets, and a further $1 billion in funding for transport projects. This government promised infrastructure spending, and transport is where you'll see that, especially on roading infrastructure. There is also large funding for KiwiRail, up $300 million, and Super Gold members with a $40 million boost in public transport concessions. So more money for roads and trains, which is no surprise as National have stated on many occasions their intention to invest in core infrastructure. Next up is the Treasury, accounting for $10 billion in annual spending. Right up the top, and the only item of real significance here, is the debt servicing, aka what we need to pay in interest for all of the government debt. In 2019, New Zealand had net debt of around $5.4 billion. Something so small, even the Mowbrays or Graham Hart alone could repay it. After Jacinda, Chris Red, and Chris Blue took the keys, it has since blown out to $80+ billion. So for these misadventures, the government must now pay over $8.5 billion a year in interest costs alone. That is roughly the same cost as running all of the primary and secondary schools in the country combined. That is why debt must be reined in, as the cost for yesterday's lolly scramble is passed on to the children of tomorrow. Another interesting item in the Treasury budget is an 88% reduction in super fund contributions, and a 33% wind back of venture capital funding. Back to basics, cutting the frills. The next department along is MB at roughly $7 billion. ACC makes up a large part of this ministry, with all associated costs up around 7.5%. So while our ACC levies are increasing, it's being put straight back into funding the core services. Aside from that, there's a further $300 million thrown into funding the Regional Infrastructure Fund, but a 16% reduction in the funding of screen production grants. In other words, we can expect to see less of Brad Pitt at the Kumu McDonald's and Jack Black at Tanuki's Cave. MB do a lot of interesting activities that feature in this list, like the $20 million encouraging foreign direct investment through InvestNZ, $38 million in video game development grants, and $7 million to apparently monitor the supermarket sector. So if you are interested in learning more about what they do, check out this list here. So this brings us to the halfway point of this list, and there are lots of other interesting areas of spending to explore. If you want to explore more of the data, I've included a link down below in the video description to check it out. So what are my thoughts on this budget? I feel like this budget is exactly what we thought we would get. It was going to be back to basics and cutting the frills. And when we look through some of the spending, they've cut a lot of the smaller stuff, but they've put in pretty decent increases in the main services. So when we talk about the hospitals, when we talk about the schools and the superannuation, the benefits, all of that kind of thing, there's actually a lot more money there than what I expected. All of these services were increasing sort of 3 to 7% over the next year in funding. So I think we got exactly what we expected. There's more back to basics and less frills. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe, as it really helps me grow the channel. Share the video with friends too if they're interested in learning more about where the government is spending their money. Also make sure to check this video out here that dives into New Zealand's highest return KiwiSaver funds. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to catching you on the next one. Cheers.